If you've been following my videos, or just know your animation history, you'll be aware that the mid-80s found Disney in a very rough spot. Their animated films had never been quite the same since the death of Walt. There had been some brighter spots, like Robin Hood and The Rescuers, but the company simply wasn't what it used to be. Now more rivals were springing up in the medium, and they were doing better. Former Disney animator Don Bluth had knocked it out of the park with The Secret of NIMH. Meanwhile, the Care Bears movie of all things had beaten Disney's Black Cauldron at the 1985 box office. Things were getting pretty dark, but that's when a glimmer of light appeared in the form of a truly great mouse detective. The movie was based on the Basil of Baker Street books by Eve Titus. In fact, the film's original title was supposed to be the same as the book series, but Jeffrey Katzenberg felt it sounded too British and worried audiences wouldn't know what the movie was about. The young Sherlock Holmes movie from the previous year had also not fared that well, so he thought that the comparison could hurt Basil's performance. The books follow Basil, a detective mouse who lives under the house of Sherlock Holmes. Basil is essentially a mouse version of Holmes, and his close friend, Dr. Dawson, is the equivalent of Watson. In several stories, Basil went up against the dreaded Professor Ratigan. Before we can talk about the book and movie versions of the deranged criminal, we should take a quick look at his own inspiration, Professor Moriarity. Moriarity is almost as well known as Holmes or Watson. Even if you've never read a Sherlock Holmes story, you probably have an idea of who this character is. His name is synonymous with archenemy. Legendary as he is, the villain only made one direct appearance in the original stories, The Final Problem. As you may know, Arthur Conan Doyle grew tired of writing the popular detective stories and decided to kill the character off. To his credit, he wanted to take Holmes out in style, allowing him to die a hero in battle against an otherwise unstoppable foe. Moriarty is described as being more or less Holmes' intellectual equal who's devoted his life to evil. As Sherlock tirelessly works to expose and halt Moriarty's massive crime ring, the villain works just as hard to kill the detective. In the end, the two men engage in hand-to-hand combat and both plunge to their deaths over the Reichenbach Falls. That is, until Conan Doyle was convinced to bring back Holmes, who was revealed to have survived. Although Moriarty is mentioned in a few other stories, the criminal truly did perish that day, with Sherlock Holmes triumphing over his greatest foe. That brings us to the Basil books. Ratigan appeared in 3 of them, usually escaping in the end. One of his more heinous acts, in Basil's opinion, is leaving a huge pile of cheese out in the open with a mousetrap hidden underneath. A mouse who uses a mousetrap against his own kind is the lowest of the low. Basil also mentions that Ratigan is the only mouse who can safely bargain with cats. Despite his name, Ratigan really is a mouse who happens to be taller than average. The only time he's called a rat is by Basil at a few points, who uses the term derisively. Other than that, even Basil usually refers to him as a mouse. In Basil and the Lost Colony, our hero is on the trail of finding the titular lost colony of mice in Switzerland. Ratigan wants revenge for Basil foiling his plans in the past, and does all he can to prevent him from reaching his goal. He stays one step ahead of the detective for most of the story. They're like each other's shadows for a while. When they finally meet face to face, the two agree to a battle, just like in The Final Problem. It plays out similarly, with both mice going over the falls, the Bach and Reich Falls to be precise. Neither of them die this time. They are both saved by Basil's St. Bernard friend. In Basil and the Pygmy Cats, also known as Basil and the Cave of Cats, Ratigan has taken over the country of Bengistan. He tells Basil that they could even rule together, and that their combined intellect would make them unstoppable. Basil refuses, and ultimately thwarts the villain. Finally, in Basil in Mexico, Ratigan teams up with another criminal, El Bruto. He's arrested at the end and stays in jail for some time. Dawson, our narrator, informs us that at a later date, Ratigan goes on to form the Anti-Basil League with some other villains, but that is yet to be told. Ratigan's main enforcer in these stories is Captain Doran, who once served in the Mouse Foreign Legion before turning to crime. He is based on one of Moriarty's chief assistants, Colonel Morin, from The Adventure of the Empty House. The Great Mouse Detective's plot was initially handled in a loosey-goosey sort of way. The creators had ideas for moments and set pieces, like a seedy bar or a fight on Big Ben, and built the story around them. This is not necessarily the best way to go about making a story, but it definitely worked out in the end. As a result of the haphazard creation phase, you can find bits and pieces of plot ideas that didn't go anywhere or were heavily retooled. An early idea, for example, shows Ratigan telling a disheveled Eliza Doolittle-looking mouse that she will be the queen. It appears that this was part of an unused Prince and the Pauper plotline. The final story involves Ratigan kidnapping a toy maker for nefarious purposes. He wants the good Mr. Flaversham to build a mechanical queen to replace the old one. Then he can make himself the royal consort. Flaversham's daughter teams up with Basil of Baker Street and Dr. Dawson to save her father and the British Empire. One of the initial general ideas for Ratigan, outside of the Eve Titus books, was summed up by his supervising animator, Glenn Keane. He found a photo of a sleazy, rich London man wearing a top hat from the 1800s. The man struck Keane as a sewer rat who presented himself as a king. In the first design stages, Ratigan looked devious, but not physically intimidating. While he was taller than Basil, he lacked the enormous physical frame he ended up with. That eventual look was inspired by Disney CEO Ron Miller, who was a former football player. The animators watched the movie Champagne for Caesar to study actor Ronald Colman as someone to model Basil on. The movie featured Vincent Price as well, and the animators realized he would be the perfect voice for Ratigan.
This is a deadly serious world, this world of business, and at some given moment you would probably revert to type.
Oh, but surely...
Why is he interrupting? I didn't indicate that I had finished talking.
Price is a Hollywood legend and a horror icon. Although he had done some voice acting in the past, it was not necessarily his forte. Nonetheless, Price settled into the role quickly and worked with the animators to get the best possible performance from each other. The dramatic flourishes and mood swings Price infused Ratigan with helped inform how the character looked and moved, and vice versa. This is, of course, the best-case scenario in any animator-voice-actor relationship, but it doesn't always pan out quite this well. As I said in the Fox and the Hound entry, it's okay to have a villain with layers. Not everyone needs to be evil for the sake of evil. We like variety in our characters. Now, with all that said, Ratigan is one of the best evil for the sake of evil villains Disney has ever done. The key ingredient? He loves what he does. He has fun with his misdeeds. He relishes in his villainy. He's worked long and hard to become the most feared criminal in London, so of course he wants to bask in his achievements. Ratigan hides out in a wine cellar underneath the riverfront pub. I like to imagine that the pub is owned by Moriarity. A secret lair so close to the sewers is appropriate for a rat.
What was that? What did you call me?
Oh, of course, I have to mention Ratigan's biggest hang-up. He's larger than all the other mice, he lives in the sewers, he has the word rat in his name, but he is a mouse. Really. Do not forget this if you value your life. I don't think the animators have ever said why specifically they made him a rat when he was a mouse in the books, but I think this is because it was such an obvious choice that it doesn't really need to be justified. Rats are more intimidating than mice, not to mention more intelligent. Mice are traditionally portrayed as cute, innocent, and resourceful, while rats are stereotypically cunning and nasty. Both creatures are vermin, but rats ultimately get the worst reputation, whether they deserve it or not. For whatever reason, Ratigan hates being reminded that he's a sewer rat. All his henchmen have to pretend otherwise. I figure someone like Ratigan would bask in being a rat, given his species' negative reputation and his own love of villainy. This is the part where I have to speculate. Is it the sewer part that bothers him so much? Does the mouse society look down on rats and he feels he needs to prove something? Most of the movie is spent among mouse characters, with only a few other animals sprinkled around. Dogs and cats are domesticated, but we see a sapient bat, a couple lizards, a frog, and an octopus. We also see that there is a mouse queen. Are there neighboring kingdoms ruled by rats, bats, lizards, and other animals? Why does Ratigan want to blend in with mice so badly when there are other rats out there? Maybe part of the reason he's doing all this is because he towers over the mice. They're easier to kick around than rats who could actually fight back. There's also a sort of Orwellian nastiness to how he treats his underlings. They all know he's not a mouse, but they'll be killed if they don't go along with his little game. This rodent complex is not the driving force behind Ratigan's wickedness. His main motivation is his intelligence. He's smart, no doubt about that, and he wants everyone to know. Only a genius like him could pull off all his terrible heists and keep getting away. One of the biggest differences between Ratigan and Moriarty is how they want people to view them. Ratigan wants to be known as the world's greatest criminal mind. Moriarty doesn't want to be known at all. He prefers to operate in secret. If someone were to connect him to all these crimes he oversees, it could topple his empire. That's exactly why he goes after Holmes in the first place, because Sherlock figured him out. Just as Sherlock was the only man who could bring down Moriarty, Basil is the only mouse who can bring down Ratigan. I criticized Disney's last movie, The Black Cauldron, for having a weak relationship between its hero and villain. The Horned King wants to take over the world, and Taran wants to stop him, but that's pretty much it. Basil and Ratigan go far beyond this. It's more than wanting to make London safe for Mousekind. It's more than wanting to save the Queen. Basil and Ratigan have a very tense, very personal history. The details are never specified, but we know that Basil has been tracking Ratigan for years. It seems that for every success the Professor had, Basil is responsible for just as many failures. These two obsess over each other. Basil has a shrine of sorts, with Ratigan's portrait dead center. Ratigan has a Basil voodoo doll. Even during his song about how great he is, Ratigan stops to monologue about how Basil has been a constant thorn in his side. That's to say nothing of the way he caresses Basil at a few points when the detective is at his mercy. I know there are some people out there, especially online, who love to romantically pair up characters for a number of reasons, no matter how illogical or silly it might be. In this case, I get it. I don't know if you can even call this subtext at a couple points. However you interpret it, it makes for a very compelling conflict between a pair of egomaniacs. Ratigan's endgame is to be king, but it's even more than that. He wants to fool all of England, Basil included. When he finds out Basil is investigating his scheme, he almost has a rage-induced heart attack, but then decides to use this to his advantage. Not only is he able to capture Basil, he's able to humiliate the detective and break his spirit. Proving he's the superior mind isn't enough, of course. Now comes the final blow. Ratigan places Basil and Dawson in an elaborate death trap, which he excitedly describes detail by gruesome detail. There's a lot of twisted love put into this, complete with a song he recorded to mock Basil in his final moments. Best of all, he set up a camera to go off at the moment the dust has settled. This scene encapsulates Ratigan perfectly. It's complete overkill, and he's so proud of his handiwork. This character is simply dripping with evil, and as much as we cheer when Basil escapes, we love the Professor just as much. Not only is Ratigan a riot when he's at the top of his game, he's a credible threat who gets truly scary by the end. For most of the movie, we see rage constantly bubbling under his surface. He manages to suppress it most of the time, letting it out at a few key moments, killing a hapless minion in his first scene, for example. But you can tell that once he reaches his breaking point, he won't be able to pull it back in as easily. It's when Basil has stopped him one too many times that Ratigan finally snaps. The huge, hulking creature can hold it back no longer. Ratigan goes feral and takes out all the rage he's been building up on the much smaller Basil. It's not even a brain versus brawn situation, since they're so closely matched in that department. Basil only has brains, but Ratigan has both. Although Basil does manage to use his wits to survive, a lot of his victory is also dependent on luck. Basil figures out that the clock is going to strike, but him getting knocked off by Ratigan to a safe distance is more serendipity than skill. There's a storyboarded version of the scene that I actually prefer. This time, Basil deliberately distracts Ratigan during the fight. As the rat pummels him, Basil begins asking him questions, like the capital of Siam. Even when he's in a frenzy, Ratigan's ego won't allow him to not answer the quiz. It's no good killing Basil if the mouse dies thinking he's the smartest. Basil is sure to hold on as the clock strikes, sending Ratigan falling. It plays out the same as the finished movie, with Ratigan pulling Basil down with him anyway. Just like Sherlock Holmes in The Final Problem, the great detective survives, while the villain does not. I like this early version because Ratigan is undone by his hubris. The actual movie fight is still great, though. Glenn Keane's supervision of the feral Ratigan recalls his work on the bear fight from Fox and the Hound. He'd do something similar again when he supervised the Beast a few years later. With all the gold and jewels he swiped, it's no surprise that Ratigan also steals the show. Equally memorable is his main sidekick, Fidget. Remember all the great things I had to say about Ratigan? Well, Fidget is just as wonderful. I really admire how versatile a character they made him. The peg-legged bat is initially built up as being scarier than he really is. He's mostly kept to the shadows and very quick, brief glimpses in the opening scene. He bursts in like a nightmare, assaulting and kidnapping Flaversham, leaving his daughter, Olivia, alone in the foggy darkness. They could have kept playing him this way, but once we get to know Fidget, we see that he's really not that frightening most of the time. More often, he's funny and unconventionally cute. And still, even after he's grown on us, Fidget pulls off one more successful jump scare in the toy store, arguably even more effective than the first one. Something to help make Fidget so endearing is his voice. We've heard Candy Candido a few times in this retrospective. He was best known for using an incredibly low, gravelly voice, but he actually had an impressive range.
The waiter's voice roared down the hall.
You get no bread with one meatball.
Candido recorded his Fidget lines in his trademark baritone, and the dialogue was sped up, making it sound higher and scratchier.
Now, you didn't forget anything?
No problem. I took care of everything. Everything on the list.
His unedited voice, meanwhile, can be heard as a bar patron.
Get off, you eight-legged bum.
Fidget was his last major role, and it was said to be one of his favorites. In my last entry, I commented that Toadwort the Ogre from the Gummy Bears seemed to draw a lot of inspiration from the Black Cauldron's Creeper. Fidget is cut from the same cloth, a hunched-over little Igor nervously trying to please his cruel master. He even has a similar face. Like Creeper and Toady, we both laugh at and pity Fidget's antics. The poor bat is another one of the many abused sidekicks in the world of animation. It's probably best not to ask how he broke his wing, or what happened to his leg. He seems to be a high-ranking member of Ratigan's mob, with his boss trusting him to do a lot of the dirty work. Sometimes it feels like Ratigan just has the rest of his gang around for the sake of staging production numbers. The Bat does just about every important job. Not only does he kidnap Flaversham, he is then sent to kidnap Olivia and steal a number of items for the Mechanical Queen. Later on, he's the one tasked with disposing of the real Queen. Him luring Basil and Dawson into the trap is more of a given. They're specifically looking for Fidget, so he had to be the bait. Even with his occasional bungling, Fidget gets the job done pretty well. He's quite nimble, despite his broken wing. The problem is, Ratigan is a what have you done for me lately kind of boss. When it turns out Fidget accidentally got Basil involved, he almost becomes Kitty Chow until Ratigan gets the idea for a trap. Near the end, it's Fidget who kidnaps Olivia again, giving himself and Ratigan the chance to escape with a hostage. Ratigan shows his appreciation by throwing Fidget out of his blimp when they're not getting away fast enough. The Bat lands with a tiny splash, and I think most of us like to hope he survived. Before we move on to the rest of Ratigan's mob, I want to address a plot hole that sometimes gets brought up. As I mentioned a moment ago, Ratigan tasks Fidget with kidnapping Olivia. This leads to a moment where he spies on her at Basil's house. The question is, how did Fidget know Olivia was there? Well, there are 2 deleted scenes that can answer that. The movie was originally going to begin with a parade in honor of the Queen. This can be seen in storyboards and a few children's books. Flaversham and Olivia are there, cheering for the Queen with the other mice. Afterward, they walk home, with Fidget following them from a distance. This is why the movie opens with Olivia saying it's been her best birthday. There's actually going to be a second instance of Fidget stalking Olivia shortly after. I found this in a comic version of the movie, which draws a lot from the storyboards. I can't be 100% sure, but I think this was planned for the film before getting cut. After Dawson finds Olivia and offers to take her to Baker Street, we would have seen Fidget following them, just like in the opening scene. You might be asking, if Fidget was already following her, why do we have the scene after of Ratigan giving him the list? I believe the whole Ratigan introduction sequence was meant to come a few hours earlier in the movie's timeline. We're seeing a flashback. I'm guessing audiences found this a little confusing, so they cut the part with Fidget stalking them. A minor plot hole that you would think about afterward is better than being actively thrown off by the story. The moment where Olivia sees him in the window really does the best job of summing up both sides to Fidget. He's scary for a second, but when Olivia's scream startles him, he goes back to being a lovable little clown. No matter how smart Ratigan is, or how many underlings he has working for him, there's one weapon up his sleeve that makes him the most dangerous: Felicia. Thanks to bribing her with plenty of tasty victims, Ratigan has tamed a cat into being a deadly pet. Felicia was inspired by Ernst Blofeld from the James Bond series. He had a Persian cat, so Ratigan would do the same. It's just different when your pet is 10 times your size. By default, cats are bigger than mice, but Felicia is extremely large. Ratigan is clearly keeping her well fed. Part of her design and attitude was drawn from Elizabeth Taylor at the time. Ratigan summons Felicia by ringing a dinner bell. The bell has a Pavlovian effect, but it's ironically not the cat that gives the reaction. Instead, it's Ratigan's own henchman. The mere sight of the bell is enough to make them tremble. They know that if they displease their boss in any way, they'll be next on the menu. Felicia's demise is a darkly ironic joke, one that they might not get away with nowadays. In trying to escape Basil's hound, she hops over a fence, only to be torn to shreds by the human queen's guard dogs. The other thugs working for Ratigan are generally interchangeable mice. Only one of them, who's always chomping cigar, sticks out. Even when he's tied and gagged near the end, he still has the cigar. Some concept art shows Ratigan with 3 non-mouse enforcers: a cat, a snake, and an owl. All 3 of them seem to be playing a similar role to Felicia. They're predators who have cut a deal with the rat. The difference between them and Felicia is that they're anthropomorphic, while Felicia is an above-average house cat. Not counting her, Ratigan has only 2 non-mouse henchmen, Fidget and Bill. Yes, sweet, innocent Bill the Lizard from Alice in Wonderland has wound up with the wrong crowd. Who knew this jittery chimney sweep had a dark side? The storyboards show a more generic lizard character, possibly even a frog, but the random choice to make him a minor Wonderland character is one I applaud. He definitely sticks out among the assorted mice. The most notable, harmless mouse underling is poor Bartholomew. He's totally drunk throughout his only scene, but I have a hard time imagining him being very threatening even when sober. Despite this, all the other thugs seem to really like him. When he mindlessly calls Ratigan a rat, they do their best to defend the little guy, but it's too late. Ratigan has lost his temper, and only feeding the tipsy little mouse to Felicia will make things better. The other mice taking off their hats and shedding a tear is the only hint we get of their tender, humane side. Thankfully for Bartholomew's sake, he's too drunk to know what's happening. Bartholomew was voiced by Barry Ingram, who, more notably, played Basil himself. Other thugs were voiced by Wayne Allwine, Tony Anselmo, Walker Edmiston, and Val Bedden, the latter of whom also voiced Dawson. The casting of Vincent Price didn't just influence how Ratigan acted, it also influenced the movie's songs. I don't think Great Mouse was ever intended to be a musical, but after Price was given the role, they wrote 2 songs for his character. Ratigan's songs had music by Henry Mancini and lyrics by Ellen Fitzhugh and Larry Grossman. Mancini, who also wrote the movie's score, is well known for his easy listening arrangements and many other film scores, including The Pink Panther and Breakfast at Tiffany's. Fitzhugh and Grossman, meanwhile, have theatrical backgrounds. The previous year, they'd collaborated on the Broadway musical Grind. Fitzhugh can also be heard in the movie as the barmaid.
There you are, boys. It's, the house.
The first song, The World's Greatest Criminal Mind, sticks out the most from a musical theater standpoint. Musicals have rules with how the songs are performed in-universe. Some musicals can have all the songs be played with visible accompaniment. They're performances, and what we're seeing in the story could plausibly play out in the real world. Then there's the more traditional musicals, where characters spontaneously burst into song and dance, with an invisible orchestra magically backing them up. 2 of the songs in the movie follow the first set of rules. Let Me Be Good to You is performed on stage with a band playing the music. Goodbye So Soon is played on a record. The World's Greatest Criminal Mind, meanwhile, follows the second set of rules. We don't see any mouse musicians frantically keeping up with Ratigan. This elaborate villain song seems to have just sprung up out of nowhere. Luckily for us, Vincent Price does such a wonderful job that it's not that jarring. In just a few moments, he's already built up Ratigan as such an over-the-top villain that his sudden showstopper feels like a logical choice. This upbeat waltz about Ratigan's accomplishments feels reminiscent of Captain Hook's waltz from the Peter Pan musical. It also anticipates Gaston's song in Beauty and the Beast. It's a riot hearing the bad guys happily sing about drowning widows and orphans. When the song was included on one of the sing-along tapes, this line was notably cut. I guess some parents weren't as pleased with the idea. Meanwhile, an alternate version was recorded for a book and tape story, with Corey Burton doing the voice and singing some new lyrics. If you wanted to hear Ludwig von Drake perform Ratigan's number, you're in luck.
Picking them off one by one, picking them off just for fun.
Such privilege, my view from the bridge, as all of them bobbed and sank. But now this matchless plot I've been hatching some much more unnatural prank.
Ratigan's other song is Goodbye So Soon, which he plays for Basil and Dawson on the record. The catch is, when the song ends, the death trap will be triggered. In this lounge number, Ratigan bids Basil a fond farewell, steeped in irony. The fact that he went out of his way to perform the song with a full orchestra and chorus says a lot about how much effort he's put into the whole thing. Even if you don't subscribe to the twisted romance interpretation, Basil is still a huge part of Ratigan's life. Had he succeeded in killing Basil and becoming king, he would probably still miss their little rat and mouse games. Behind the snide mockery is a secretly heartfelt farewell. A much more sincere version of the song plays over the credits. Finally, we have the villain themes that Mancini wrote. Ratigan is often represented by the World's Greatest Criminal Mind melody. There are also points where he has a shorter, sleazy motif. Fidget gets a devious theme to himself. Finally, the Mechanical Queen gets a frantic theme, which I believe is villain-adjacent enough to be worth a mention. I'd like to take this moment to remind viewers that I generally don't talk about the House of Mouse series in these retrospectives. The same will apply to the recent Once Upon a Studio. So many characters have appeared in them that it's almost easier to list the ones that weren't used. The only time I plan on bringing them up is if there is something notable about these appearances, like an important plotline or a different voice actor. In fact, that last part does apply this time. In The House of Mouse, Ratigan was very briefly voiced by Maurice LaMarche.
Dawson, you fool! Can't you see it's a trap?
Curses!
The theme parks have been pretty barren for great mouse representation. No cheese carts in the UK pavilion at Epcot, no blimp ride through Big Ben. Talk about your missed opportunities. Ratigan received a large walk-around character at the time of the movie's release. Even Vincent Price found him intimidating.
They've created him, you know, like they have Minnie Mouse and Mickey Mouse walking around in Disneyland. Well, they now have Professor Ratigan, and he's about 8 feet tall. When I met him the first time I met him, I was scared to death of him. But the kids love him, because he is really a very lovable villain.
The character was rarely used, apparently last spotted at a Halloween event in 2004. The best place to see him is an old promotional footage and a very odd music video from France. Oh, they know what's up. A year after the movie was released, it would receive a video game. Basil the Great Mouse Detective was released for home computers and appears to be a sequel. Dawson has been kidnapped, and the detective must search for clues to find his friend. Along the way, he encounters Ratigan's various minions, including a few mice, Bill the Lizard, and of course, Fidget. For those of you hoping to see the evil professor himself, I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you. The ending has Basil freeing Dawson and pursuing Ratigan in the air. The narration tells us that Ratigan's blimp is too fast, and the villain gets away without a proper encounter. Despite the to-be-continued message, no further games were ever made. The video game is really only a sequel in a very loose sense. For better or for worse, there was never a follow-up movie or TV series about Basil's further adventures. The one place we could see these was in the comics. As I've said time and time again, the Europeans were the ones who really lucked out in this case. Disney comics are nowhere near as big in North America, and almost all the Great Mouse stories remain untranslated. There are nearly 100 comic stories that have featured Basil solving different mysteries. While Basil and Dawson are strong enough characters on their own, the adventures wouldn't be quite the same without Ratigan. Bringing him back wouldn't be too out of the question. It's true he fell off Big Ben, but Disney has written many comics with the witch from Snow White, and she clearly died in her movie. Well, they did bring back Ratigan, and they actually explained his recovery. He used his cape as a parachute on the way down. Ratigan only appeared in maybe a third of the Basil stories, but he remained the detective's archenemy. I think that's a good way to handle his character. Have him show up enough to be a great villain, but don't have him appear too often so he doesn't lose his bite. At least not all of it. I'll admit he does seem to have lost his bite a little, but that's to be expected. He no longer has the enormous gang of thugs working for him. While we do see some hired help, most of the time his only henchmen are Fidget and Felicia, who have both survived their own ordeals. It's surprising to see Fidget giving his boss another chance, but I guess old habits die hard. Ratigan's dastardly deeds in the comics range from fraudulent charities, to jewel heists, to kidnappings. A criminal of his standing needs to be well-rounded. One comic was a direct adaptation of the Sherlock Holmes story, The Red-Headed League. It had Ratigan form the Society of Tall Mice, as a front for stealing an enormous fortune. One of the most interesting comics is actually American. One of the final issues of Disney Adventures featured a story starring Olivia Flaversham and her sidekicks, Toby the Hound, and a now-reformed Fidget. The sideshow Sea Beast has them investigating a monster mouse on display at a carnival. I'd been wondering about this story for quite some time, and I was actually able to reach out to the author for some answers. Elizabeth Wattison was kind enough to answer my questions about how the story was formed. According to her, the magazine's head editor was looking for some new spins on Disney properties. Elizabeth pitched the idea of Olivia and Fidget solving monster-related mysteries together. She didn't really have a backstory about how they teamed up, and she had 3 comics planned out, but only one was ever written. Disney Adventures ceased publication after the first story. I suppose the circumstances behind Fidget's reformation are up to the fans. He and Olivia really don't like each other in the movie, but I like to hope that there's some good in him underneath all that wickedness. Besides, if I was writing a Great Mouse Detective story, Fidget's inclusion would be my top priority too. The Great Mouse Detective did moderately well at the box office. It wasn't a resounding success, but it helped keep the lights on at Disney's animation department, which is victory enough. Even though the company has let the movie fall through the cracks, it's a highly enjoyable adventure, and is generally well liked by animation fans. It's sad that a terrific villain like Ratigan hasn't appeared more. The Horned King, despite the Black Cauldron being viewed as a much bigger disappointment by Disney, has still had more moments in the spotlight than the Great Mouse villains. I know I'm editorializing here, what else is new? But this movie really deserves more love. And hey, we've talked a lot about Ratigan's life of crime, but do you know what's really criminal? The lack of Fidget merchandise. And so, we'll say goodbye so soon to Ratigan and his gang. Our next entry will be fudging the rules a bit. Is The Brave Little Toaster a Disney movie? You could argue both ways, but it's a very important film to me, so I'll bend the rules in its favor. I'm always ready to talk Toaster. And I won't be alone. I'll be having input from the movie's director, Jerry Rees. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all on the cutting edge. Well, the cutting edge circa 1987.
Like all Walt Disney films, does it have a happy ending?
Of course it's happy ending. But I got a feeling as I watched it, maybe there could be a return of Professor Ratigan.